Hello, everyone. Well, welcome to our Friday Forums. My name is Cindy McDonald, and I am your very honored host to be here on another Friday. And I'm so grateful to have you here. We had well over almost 200 people sign up for this webinar today. So talking about adolescents, the anxiety that they're facing, what we're facing, and some of is the topic for today. And as you log in, I see we've got quite a few people already. Add in the chat, tell us hello, tell us where you're from. We love having you here. And I am going to introduce you to our very special guest, Jed Applerouth. Hi, Jed.
Hi, Cindy. How are you?
Good. I'm so glad to have you here. This is a topic I know that's near and dear to your heart.
Absolutely.
You keep, have a real strong understanding. You work with adolescents through your tutoring, and we're so glad to have you here to talk about this, especially during this time of a pandemic, right?
Yes.
Who would have thought such a little thing would turn the whole world upside down for, who knows how long? And, we're counting months now, and first we thought maybe it would be weeks. So, and now students are getting ready to go back to school or not going back to school, as the case may be. So I see we're getting lots of people who are familiar with you, love you.
Oh, awesome. It's funny. I did have one friend who was prescient. He sent me a text. It was like late January, February. And he's like, Jed, buy a bag of beans, buy some rice, run for the hills. There's this new thing coming out of China. Like, we had no idea. I was traveling in January, February. I was in New York. I was in Chicago. I was bouncing around the country. And it's like, this is going to be enormous. He's like, he was reading The Lancet and articles, things out of China. He's like, this thing's going to be huge. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There was no sense in January, February this was even a possibility. But I had one friend out in California getting a PhD in neuroimaging and neuroscience. He's like, this thing is going to be enormous. So he saw it, and he was talking about shorting all the stock markets. He's like, it's going to be tremendous. And turns out he was right. But so he had a sense of it. I had one friend who was months and months ahead of everybody else. It's kind of wild. He was reading all the tea leaves.
Well, I had a friend who was in one of my classes with me, and she went to China in December.
Okay.
So she wasn't in Wuhan, but she was in one of the other provinces. So we were communicating back and forth as she was going through the lockdown. So watching that and seeing that, and then when I started seeing it spread, I knew it was coming. I just knew, and I knew because I knew what she had been through. And they had, they started sheltering in place in January, and they were still sheltering in place in March. So I knew it wasn't going to be a day or two type of thing. So. So what are we going to do? How do we help our adolescents right now and the anxiety that they're feeling?
Well, let me dive in. And so I figured today we have an hour, right? 2 to 3,
Yep.
Or your time 11 to 12. I've delivered several presentations before on anxiety, and I thought a lot of it is actually still quite relevant. And there's anxiety as a construct, anxiety how it manifests, notions of stress, being adaptive, then suddenly it becomes maladaptive and anxiety and fear, and it shuts you down. So I thought it would be helpful to start off with about 25 minutes or so, just some basic foundations, and then really dive into more specifics in terms of with the current situation, with the pandemic, because a lot of these things apply. They definitely do generalize to this context and many, many others. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to begin with just a number of slides. And okay, so we're trying to lower anxiety, and some of the basics, just at a foundational level, there are a lot of things right now that our teens are facing that are stressful, and some of them, in terms of social pressures and other things, and the news cycle, but also, they've faced things. Everyone has sacrificed something because of the pandemic. Everyone's lives have been disrupted. Our teenagers have lost a lot. In terms of the seniors who had their senior skip day remotely, or their prom remotely, or things that they really, having freshman year on Zoom. It's like, wow, how many, experiences they're missing. And they're also watching the news in terms of current unemployment rates, that some of them are afraid for their health, some have conditions. Some of them are afraid for their families. Some of them have lost members of their family or seen people getting very sick. So there are very real things that are stressful. And then always in life, there are the imagined things and the real things. And right now, this is very real. And part of it, as we have increased stressors out there, we're doing fewer things that help reduce and mitigate stress in our lives. And some of them, they're being dictated by the CDC, because touch, connection, friendship, in-person stuff, these things decrease, they lower our levels of stress and cortisol. So we're grappling with this. There's an author, I really enjoyed her work and her research, Jean Twain, and I saw her 3 or 4 times in a year. She was bouncing around the circuit, pushing her book. But she's pulling from this study. It's a 44-year-old study out of Michigan, looking at. It was initially funded trying to figure out why, looking at alcohol use, substance abuse, and other issues. But it really has become a larger study of what's happening with our young people. And one of the things that we've learned, our kids today are sleeping less than kids 15, 20, 30 years ago. A lot more kids are sleep deprived. And all these things are going to fuel fear and fuel anxiety and lower our ability to self-regulate and manage fear and stressors. And a lot of this has to, body maintenance and self-care and hygiene are a lot of things which help give us the tools and the resources, the inner resources to manage stress better. When you're not sleeping, and all of you know this, like you get jumpier, you have a different level of startle reflex, different, corticotropin releasing factors. You definitely are more reactive when you aren't sleeping as well. A lot of our kids are more reactive. And when you aren't sleeping as well, that affects your ability to emotionally regulate. And sleep is a giant, neuro reset. Clears out toxins, helps really get you back to center again. Additionally, we all have our devices, and we use them a lot. It's interesting. I have a 4-month-old baby upstairs, and she's starting to have a relationship with the phone. And when she sees it, and my wife says, she understands, she's kind of performing, and it changes her behavior when she's on the phone. Or because part of it, my mother is right now out of state, and so she wants to see the baby, and she lives a little further away, and so we're doing plenty of FaceTiming. And so it's interesting watching my baby interacting and changing when she realizes, there are these people on the phone, my nephews in DC, my mother. But young people today, they're spending a lot of time on their devices. And as are adults, but kids even more so, and teens even more so. Texting, gaming. There's a whole thing today about Fortnite versus Apple, and so many young people are playing these games on their devices, video chat, FaceTime, Zoom. So 6 hours a day on average is what kids are spending, which is a lot of time. And then squeezing out time that would be, think about when you were a teen. Think about things you did and what things helped you soothe your, manage anxiety, feel more calm, more centered. And these devices are lovely and wonderful and life-changing, but there are costs. So, we gain and we lose. And there's really a question of the balance of that. What have we gained? What have we lost? With having these things tethered to us, squeezing out some of our time to reflect, some of our time to have our brains go into a different, the different mode of just not, thinking and info coming in, but just reflective and relaxing and kind of processing. So we've learned that more than 5 hours plugged into our devices, there are serious costs. We have that affect sleep. You have increased risk of suicidal, thoughts and ideation and actually attempts. And it affects levels of happiness versus those who use their devices very, very minimally. So more than 5 hours versus 1 hour, there are big changes. And then if there are things, these are part of things being squeezed. And even in a pandemic, the things that actually help us, tend to feel better. 7 hours of sleep at night, that helps us feel grounded, better, more happy, less anxious. Activities, athletics, moving our bodies. One of my good friends has a daughter who was super social, super active, and 2 months into the pandemic was going nuts, losing it, getting mad at her little brother, mouthing off at my friend Brian and Mara. And honestly, it was to the point where it's just leave the house. And part of it, they began making her get out and exercise and move and run because the time cooped up. Because she's a super extrovert, but the exercise was really, really helping her dramatically. But that's part of it, managing your emotions. In-person interaction is way better for health than screen interactions. Screen may be the best you have, but when you see a friend, even from a 6-foot distance, and you can get all the nonverbals, all the communication that's happening, hear their voice versus a text. And then there's other research that getting a text, it's even hearing someone's voice is more like a hug than getting a text message. That there's an emotional connection that happens with the voice, and then with the face, and then with the body, and every level removed from that, it's less satisfying and less connecting and less like mammals, more like machines. Other things that create some benefit in terms of self-regulation, going to a service of your religious, of your choice, being involved with that, and then print media, like reading a book, is very different, and it's the kind of speed of processing and the depth of processing versus very shallow, speedy when we're scrolling through things, we're glancing around, bouncing around, knowing there's a link behind this, versus when I'm holding up a book, and I know I'm going to be spending 20 minutes reading my book, and there are no other distractions and no other rabbit holes. I'm not going to go from this to this to this to this to this. I'm going to be reading this book for 20 minutes. And it puts you into a different frame of mind, a different frame of body. And it changes how you think and how you process. So all of these things are linked to more happiness. And the other screen things are like the more loneliness, more notions of isolation, and more comparison to others, versus all these things ground you in self, ground you in your body, sleeping, exercising, reading, relaxing, all these things, being with other people. So there is the pandemic, but well beyond this, the issues about anxiety in teens, this has been the biggest topic for the past 3 or 4 years. And it really is, the base rates of anxiety are changing in our society. And part of it we're looking at, we think the devices are part of the issue. And for sure, this is a big deal. Comparison culture, the sense, you all heard about FOMO, and everyone's living a better life than I am. And there's so much more comparison constantly in the Instagram and comparing yourself to others. And that is just, if you want a recipe for anxiety, start comparing yourself to others. And people who are passively scrolling through their feeds on Instagram or, in chat, on Snapchat, other things, the more they're passively looking at other people's lives, they feel worse about their own life, how they're doing. But part of it is, it's, the inauthenticity of it and the whole performance nature of someone will take 30 pictures to get that one, they're going to press send, and then you're comparing yourself, my God, they look amazing, but that, this is artificial. It's artifice, it's performance. And so it's a whole notion of you're performing a self. You aren't living authentically, because, we're messy, and things are often boring, and things aren't exciting. But if you start to compare yourself to these, the feeds they have, it's like, my God, my life sucks by comparison. But again, the brain forgets it's artifice. So anxiety, this has preceded the pandemic, and it'll survive the pandemic. It's really a thing we're going through as a society. So 40 million Americans each year are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. 1 in 3 Americans will have a clinically important anxiety condition over the course of their lifetime. And then, Xanax, this number is actually higher now. A lot of scripts for, Alprazolam and other anxiety medications. And the biggest thing is we've seen this on college campuses. So it's teens right now, but in college, there's been so much anxiety. I have friends who work on college campuses in the counseling offices, and they are slammed. Because part of it, thankfully, there's less of a stigma for getting support for anxiety. Like 20 years ago, what's wrong with you? Now it's become more normalized, maybe reality shows or whatever it is, but now it's okay, less of a stigma going. And so the demands being placed on the counseling offices are overwhelming. So you have 54% of young of students at college feeling overwhelming anxiety. So again, this is before the pandemic. It's really a big concern. One of my colleagues who works at Emory, a good friend of mine, got my PhD with her, Sherry, and she pulled this from the mental health report in college, that a third of adolescents will meet the criteria for anxiety disorder by 18. This is all before the pandemic. There's a 30% increase in students seeking college counseling, and 6/10 of it is for anxiety and depression and stress. And then we have a real increase in the base rates of suicide, which is terrible, but it's happened. It happened in my high school. It's happened, there were 4 at my college. It's like this thing is real. So anxiety, depression, panic attacks, anxiety is the number one in terms of mental health issues in college. And then impediments to success, when we ask kids, what are the things getting in your way? We see that stress has become a bigger factor. Anxiety, it's up 20%. Having trouble sleeping is up. Depression is up, like 30%. So there are things, that work pressures are down. People are working less in this generation. problems with relationships. They're actually declining because people are less involved in long-term committed things. So there are interesting things happening in our society. So I'm going to shift now from just defining it to talk about what do we do with it? How do we address it with these kids who are nervous and stressed in this pandemic and in life in general? When the pandemic ends, there will be stress beyond it, and worries about career, and worries about economic success, and and so forth. So part of it, one of my good friends, Gary Glass, he's a brilliant fellow over at Emory before he was at Duke, and he talks about like language and the framing of things, and how we frame things, is profoundly important. And the notion of stress and differentiating, I feel stressed versus I have a clinical anxiety, functionally limiting anxiety. And people throw around the term anxiety on a regular basis. And he says, let's take it back a step. And what's a normal amount of stress? And then versus, you're really feeling debilitating, crippling, limiting anxiety. And his notion is, are we pathologizing a natural and normal experience? And the manner in which we discussed it, I'm like, Mom, I'm anxious versus, Mom, I'm feeling some stress about this upcoming test. And you respond differently. Even the word, I'm having anxiety, you begin feeling less capable, less resourced, versus I'm experiencing some stress, versus the anxiety component, there's a fear overlaid on top of that. So defining terms, this is from Gary, the normal stress is the normal emotional reaction to an immediate or perceived actual threat. So I'm feeling some stress about this experience, about getting into college. I'm feeling stress about taking my test in a week. I'm feeling stress about other things versus anxiety. And it's an experience of fear located at some point in the future where the threat's a mere possibility. And when kids feel afraid, they might really shift their focus to the future where they're less able to affect things in the present. And that's the whole thing about fear and the fear center. The amygdala is a very important part of the brain, a little almond-shaped part of the limbic system. And its primary job is to keep us alive and scan for threats. And that's a very helpful thing. And it's imprinted, it's tied to, to our long-term memory and other events, sensory input. And so this sensory input comes in, talks to my amygdala, talks to long-term memory, like, oh gosh, this is, ultimately this thing should be, be afraid, this might hurt you. And so the amygdala is doing us a great service. And I'm very thankful, we have one, otherwise we wouldn't have made it this far as a species. And, but ultimately it can be overactive and overstimulated. And when you are spending too much time in that fear center, when you're really afraid, it can diminish your ability to problem solve. And actually that's part of this thing, what can I do? And part of it is shifting, they talk about that from, the amygdala, that being really active, to the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex, where you can actually solve problems. And it's doing this shift. There's something called GABA, butyric acid. And it's GABA essentially inhibits and calms down the amygdala. And when you start getting into the forebrain, you send GABA back and it calms the amygdala and begins to inhibit that signal, that information. And so let's move from this place of fear where I feel I can't do anything or I'm scared versus what is in my power, what can I do? And whenever you start problem solving and strategizing, the amygdala begins to calm down. So it's that's the whole thing about agency and what can I do now versus fear is often circular and begins to ratchet up. And there's a sense of often powerlessness when you're really in this fear loop. And so the whole thing is, what can we do to stop? What's the next right thing, the next right moment that I can do to affect my conditioned situation? And that's how you begin to break the cycle of anxiety. Stress. Stress in and of itself is really important. And, we all know this at some level, that without stress, we are not at our best. And there's something that's called eustress, EU, euphoria, euphony. So eustress is the right level. There's pressure. I know this matters. There's some arousal I'm feeling. And that can often get you in your peak performance when there's some stress. And often people, when you're in your peak, when you're in your flow moments, you're feeling that this matters. But you're bringing to bear all of your talents and resources. That's eustress. Then you get on the other side, and then you're in distress. And this is 1908, the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's a very old idea. But in distress, that is, there's too much of it. And often it's tied, there's too much stress hormone, catecholamine, There's too much cortisol coursing through, too much epinephrine. It's not good. You're shaking, you're not, or you're frozen. There's, the whole fight or flight or freeze or fold. You're not in this optimal state. You're past it. And you're in survival or fear mode. So the name of the game is, how do I bring things back up to eustress, where you're in the right level of stress and arousal? So the notion of, stress is bad, that's not true. But excessive stress. So some stress is actually really, really helpful. And there are times we've all worked with ourselves, and we've seen young kids where there isn't enough stress. And there's just, they don't care. And then they're, it's like, it doesn't matter. And then it's like, no, I want to generate some stress to get you up to this point where you're going to be at your best. So again, stress is perfectly normal and adaptive and healthy. Adding some stress hormone, you need it. Before I start a test, I want to have a little kick of adrenaline. I want some norepinephrine. I want to have a little cortisol. A little stress hormone helps me focus. And if you don't have that, you're a little bit dysregulated, because part of it helps you inhibit other information, it helps you focus, it helps you get centered. Too much, though, begins to affect your working memory. Things, again, there's a little bit great, too much not great, which is many neuromodulators and hormones in our body. A little bit is perfect, too much is not great. So a low level can help you with planning and problem solving. What can I do now to affect my situation? But too much, again, you can experience, redundant, or here, actually, you can experience some redundant or repetitive worries and still lead to action if you're, actually problem solving. And then you can begin to use self-care, relaxation, calming to maintain performance when when there is some stress. So some stress is actually perfect and adaptive, and we all feel it. And performers feel it, and anyone who has to, get on stage and do, there is going to be some stress, unless you've gone totally zen and you are just floating above all of it. But even performers, they get a shot of stress hormone, which helps them perform, but they regulate it, and they talk themselves, okay, I'm feeling excited, not I'm terrified. And then you reframe the arousal. That's also a tool. But again, what we're seeing here, there are kids where excessive fear, becomes maladaptive. It deactivates the problem-solving centers. You stop trusting yourself and your ability to affect your environment, and it leads you to begin to imagine a dangerous or unhappy future or place. So we want to stay in the healthy adaptive zone. And so anxiety, when there's too much of it, too much stress and fear, it affects you in every way. It affects you academically, grades drop. It affects you socially. It affects your health and well-being. And again, the sleep, the appetite, other health concerns. I've actually seen this. When someone starts getting really dysregulated with food and sleep, it happened to a colleague of mine, a friend of mine. It's kind of a long story, but in the grand scheme, he began to really get off, and he was eating at weird times. He wasn't sleeping well. And then he began to self-medicate, and there's a whole thing that began happening. But part of it, there was a lot of fear and anxiety. But when you see patterns like sleep and food are getting really whacked, really off, it's like that's when it's almost time for the intervention. Then it's like this is because these things help keep you grounded. That's when you have a disorder. It affects functionally limiting your other experiences in life. Common denominators in life. I'm feeling scared. I'm afraid of academic anxiety. I'm afraid I'm not going to have the life I was hoping for. I'm afraid I'm not who I thought I was. I'm afraid of ending up by yourself. Humans, we have a real need for connection socially. The way you make someone crazy is you isolate them. That's, one of the biggest tortures we have is solitary confinement. We need human connection. And so being afraid and then being lonely. I'm alone, I'm isolated. These are like two of the primary things of excess anxiety about what's coming. Okay, I'm just going to skip these. In this slide about defining success in terms of, there are many, many different ways to define what it means to be a success versus some kids this was talk about, I'm afraid of being a failure. I'm afraid of failing. And versus like, how are you defining success? In terms of your life and is like having a grade point average, getting into a certain college. How are you defining and framing this idea of you being a success, and even that conversation of your philosophy? So these are more practical tools here in terms of talking about stress and anxiety. Part of it is listening to parents, and some of this is when parents have stress and anxiety, and she's saying one thing, but behind that, It's like, I'm really scared my daughter's not going to have the life. We have to make it happen. She'll be okay. She'll be safe. There are times that parents are actually fueling some of the anxiety and stress that kids are feeling. And that's, it's part of it. And the kids have to make some separation from the parents. But I've seen it. I've worked with kids where the source of the anxiety wasn't endogenous. It was actually exogenous. It was coming externally, that they were internalizing and channeling the parental fears and anxieties. And so that is a real thing. And so being mindful of sometimes subtle pressures, nuanced languages where the kids are picking it up, that there's a lot of pressure, I'm feeling stress coming externally and I'm internalizing it, and so forth. Another issue with stress and fear and anxiety has to do with, in psychology, we call it dichotomous thinking. It's either black or white. And this kind of thinking, Albert Ellis, Beck, the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy, talked about this, it's rigid thinking. And whenever things get really rigid, that's a danger, in the world of mental health. This or that, good or bad. If I get in here, I'm a success. If I don't, I'm a failure. All these things like that. And so this is the right outcome. This is the right score. This is the right, and it gets so rigid. And if it doesn't happen, there's a real stress event. And part of it, as a therapist, when I'm working with someone, I want to get somebody away from that kind of rigid outcome, like that framing of the outcome. It's this or it's a failure. I get in here or my life's, broken. And trying to reintroduce the entire range, and you're going to be okay. And I think it was Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavioral therapy, he talked about masturbation. It must be this. It's like that, or awfulizing. If I don't have this, it's going to be awful. And it's like, really? And part of it is checking, poking holes in that, and getting someone off that kind of compulsive or obsessive kind of thinking. It has to be this way, and that can be a real cause of stress for kids. And it was right here. And the shoulds. It'll be a catastrophe if this doesn't happen, or it'll be awful. And part of it, we're selling out our abilities to problem solve and adjust and face futures. And that's the whole thing of control. Anxiety and control are often tied together. I want to control the outcomes versus I want to let life unfold. And this rigid thing, it's leads to a less happy life, a more toxic inner life, trying to control this life because you can't. And that's you are setting yourself up for a lot of pain and suffering by trying to control things that are beyond your control. And right now, like when you're in a pandemic, dear God, you can control so little. Things, your school is all set up, and then the rug gets pulled out, and then my test is signed up, then this thing changes. Someone gets sick. It's like you have to find a way to be able to flow and learn to adapt, like in this river of life, and you're part of it, and you have agency, but you can't control all of it. And kids who get in real trouble are the ones trying to rigidly control their schedules, their lives. It's like, do what it's in your control, but not trying to control things outside of you. And so from Gary, a good friend of mine again, the opposite of control is not chaos. The opposite of control is actually trust. And that, I'm going to pause for a moment on that, because I think that's really, really powerful. This is a slide from Gary. With his permission, I'm using this slide. But when you ask people, like, what's the opposite of control? It's like out of control, chaos. But no, it's, I don't have to be in control. I actually can trust and work with my life. And can you move towards trust and away from fear and control? One of my good friends, Brian Bailey, he's been in the world of addictions and recovery for about 35 years. He's been a sponsor to probably over 100 people at this point. His whole thing is like letting go of the trapeze. That's one of his metaphors, like controlling versus like letting it happen, and often with addiction, there is control. And people who are really tied up with addiction or self-harm, and there's a lot of control and secrecy and just letting go of their rigidity. And so the very foundation of trying to control comes from a fear of the future. And can we trust our ability to solve problems and face challenges versus trying to anticipate and pre-plan all of them versus, I have a pretty good mind. It's like trying to pre-plan, the conversation you're going to have and get all the words out just right versus in the moment, can I trust myself that I'll say the right thing? And that really, honestly, that's a paradigm shift. When you move to a place of trust, I trust myself, my inner resources, and it's honestly, it's a very nurturing stance versus I don't trust, and the only way I can get through this life is by trying to control everything that I can. And it just makes life less pleasant. So this is about, function, but also about, hedonism, the pleasure of living. And if you're always controlling, it steals a lot of the joy out of being alive and the spontaneity and the, versus people who are happy often aren't rigidly controlling everything. A few other slides about communications. When your child is telling you about their feelings, like letting them, really being in talking through, being open as they explore the space of their own solutions, letting them, because again, your adolescents are in this phase of transition towards adulthood, but they're trying out being adults, and versus you solving things for them, trying to really let them, making space for them, reflecting back to them, framing things for them, but letting them walk through things they can do. More of a positive, like a strength-based approach to things you know how to do. When people come to you and say, I'm afraid, or kids say, I'm scared, mom or dad, and responding to the content, the feelings, summarizing things back to them, and validating what is valid and with empathy. But if they're really, there are times therapeutically, I'll invalidate certain things that are invalid, but I'll validate things that are, and feelings are valid. I feel nervous, scared. One of the simplest things you can do, this is from this modality of therapy called Hakomi therapy that I've spent some time learning about, and in the training I went to. And one of the coolest things is just acknowledging, kind of touching the feeling. Someone says, oh, I'm so terrified, this and this, and I don't know. And it's like, scary, isn't it? I'm like, oh, wow. Like a little, a few words. Sounds really scary. You seem a little nervous. I guess, someone comes and their eyes are welling up, like a lot of feelings there. And, as a parent, this is like, as a therapist, things you would say to kind of touch the feeling and validate it and let them go further into it, kind of to deepen whatever they're experiencing and have them come and talk about what's going through it with them, versus trying to fix it or solve it or jump in, just acknowledging it, the emotion. Sometimes this doesn't take that much skill. Just to acknowledge it and see it and name it, and then step back and let them keep going further. That's really a tool to help someone as they're exploring their emotion, their feelings. Another area that I do pull some into is some humor. There are times we use a little bit of gallows humor, especially during a pandemic. The memes and the things my friends were all sharing with each other as we're getting these awful stats and life and death, and we're sharing these ridiculous things with each other. Because part of it, it does create good feelings and helps us with our inner chemistry when we can laugh and have a moment not being tied up in these circuitous thoughts of fear and negative things. So other things, kids who might experience more anxiety, fear, especially with kids with disabilities, nervous, because in terms of their supports they need and so forth, and also kids who are in talented and gifted classes, kids in upper higher level classes are often have more anxiety in terms of if their performance is more tied to their self-concept and their identity. And if I don't do well here, my identity is threatened. There is often more anxiety, more test anxiety among these kind of groups. In terms of with test anxiety, writing about anxiety has been known to help. There's some research that even just writing how it affects you, writing the way it's showing up for you can be beneficial. So drawing some attention, but not in a circuitous, ruminating way, but I'm actually writing for 10 minutes about how this anxiety is showing up in my life. And I mentioned the idea of reappraising arousal, that some heartbeats, a little faster, on sweaty palms is actually okay. And like in some level of stress hormone, this is a slide from a deck on test anxiety, but it can actually improve performance having, versus don't be afraid of some stress. Don't be afraid of a little bit of, increased stress response in your body. It's actually okay and healthy and adaptive. So reframe it as a positive versus I'm nervous because my heart's beating fast. No, it's okay. It's just, your body's way of getting you ready to focus on this test is giving a little shot of norepinephrine, a little shot of cortisol. Self-talk, inner dialogue is everything. And as when I'm working in a therapeutic capacity, I want to find out what thoughts are you having, which are going to be fueling or slowing down your fear and anxiety. Your inner dialogue is everything. There are external messages, but it's the internal ones that you've internalized and you're repeating can fuel it or extinguish it. And so the brain is listening to your messages you're saying to yourself. And there's, the inner critic, the negative things. And part of it is, what do you do with that? One thing I like to do is doing some distancing from the negative thinking and the critical thinking and the fearful thinking. And I create, it's, a bit of a Jungian shift, but there's a separate internal self part that's the centered, wiser part of you. There are aspects of self, the psyche, and there is one. And so part of it is talking to yourself from the first person. That if I'm feeling nervous, I'm feeling scared, I'm feeling ineffective, whatever it is, I speak to myself from this other part saying, Jed, you can do this. Jed, yeah, you've got this. Jed. And then part of it is even that little separation from I'm swimming in my anxious thoughts versus the separate kind of little centered, wiser part of me speaks. And there's research out of Michigan that this kind of cognitive distancing from yourself can actually, make a real difference in terms of self-regulation, calming yourself down, getting yourself back focused when you speak to yourself in the first person. So that's a little tiny trick. It's worth a slide. Other times when people really have a strong anxiety feeder, and there are a lot of anxious, nervous messages, the idea of creating an external form, an external figure to hold those voices. So it's not, oh God, I'm making myself crazy. Like, oh, that's just Murray. That's just, or that's Karen or Murray or whatever the voice, like just feeding. And you know what? And that's your job. That's what you do. Thank you for that. And that little bit of separation from self to this external thing helps you regulate it. Like, okay, thank you. Then you can imagine putting Murray on an island, saying, there's Murray again, versus, oh gosh. And, it's like, what do you do with your thoughts? Like thoughts, they come all the time, and don't put too much importance on them. Like Jung said, they were like animals running through a forest. Thoughts come and go, and don't privilege them or make them so important. And that's just Murray yapping again. Thanks, Murray. Appreciate that. And so that's a healthy strategy. I like that strategy. And there are times I've had kids like draw the monster. It's giving them all the anxious, fearful thoughts. We know after thousands of years that one of the primary technologies to managing anxiety is the breath. And when you're breathing in a shallow way, in a short way, you are fueling off an anxiety. When you do deep diaphragmatic breathing, the diaphragm goes in and out, and it puts pressure on the vagus nerve, which sends signals back up to the head, and that activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic slows everything down. Your pulse, your rate of respiration, your breathing rate, your blood pressure. So when you are doing deep breathing, you are activating this system, this parasympathetic system, to bring everything back down. We've known this for thousands of years. So teaching kids how to do this, showing them the breathing count, the 4 count of breathing, breathing in, and then you hold it, and then breathing out, hold it, and breathe, and showing kids, having them practice this. And so whenever you can get that vagus nerve stimulated through this good, slow breathing, everything calms down. It's like it washes over you. So whenever you're getting worked up, this is a major strategy, and it works. Exercise. There is nothing as good as exercise to keep yourself regulated, your emotions and feelings regulated. It helps with addiction. It helps with compulsive behaviors. It helps with depression. It affects so many great neurotransmitters. It affects your levels of serotonin. It affects your levels of dopamine, your endorphins. That's your endogenous morphine brings down the pain. And so all these things, that take place when we exercise. And so and part of it is good cardiovascular, so getting your heart up. That good squeeze helps, that sends the cascade of these neurotransmitters and hormones. So when someone's really getting worked up on their anxiety, get out there and, get on a bike, exercise, do whatever helps you bring this back down. And sleep, I mentioned earlier. Sleep hygiene is everything as well, because sleep clears out toxins, waste. It's a massive reset. So being careful about the amount of caffeine your kids are taking in. Be careful about the blue light. We know that the blue light from our devices, that's actually why I wear these. This filters out at least half the blue light. And I have a real pair, which filters out like 70% of the blue light, which looks a little bit funnier for a webinar and changes the color. But ultimately at night, I actually do wear these when I'm looking at a screen, because the blue light inhibits melatonin, and melatonin is, what you need to help, calm things down and get ready for sleep. So, and again at night, I often take a bath, other things to bring you back down to manage, sleep. Other things, being in nature, we know this is good stuff. We know this helps. Taking a walk outside, there's all this research and evidence that it helps you calm your anxiety back down. Looking at a distant, looking at trees and the space versus looking at a screen. There's something very calming, very grounding. After millions of years living on the savannah and other places, we are grounded in nature. We are of nature. And human connections, one of the best ways to deal with stress is using other human beings. I have a little 4-month-old baby upstairs. Whenever she's stressed out, I hold her close. And then in many cases, and I kind of move her and I'll hush and she'll calm down. But it's the contact. We have these certain, they call like afferent nerves, a certain, nerves with certain pressure, soft pressure, our body relaxes. So a good hug. My wife and I have a practice where it's like when someone is really worked up, we do a 20-second hug. And then after about 12 seconds, you feel your body just relax. So not just, hey, honey, but it's like a real, like a hold, and then your body calms down. And what it is, it's oxytocin. And it's this, very important chemical that is very much involved with breastfeeding and babies and, birth and all this. And whenever, I'm seeing it in it, but myself, I feel it looking at my baby, and I stare in her eyes. I just feel it cascading over me, and suddenly it's like you melt. And I've never experienced this level of connection or this level of oxytocin as with having a new baby. But what it does, it reduces anxiety. It drops fear. It suppresses and inhibits cortisol. So we have this balancing of these neurohormones and modulators. Cortisol is a catecholamine stress hormone, but oxytocin comes in and cortisol levels drop. And we know Sapolsky's research, all the primates, the chimpanzees or the bonobos, the orangutans who groom the most and touch the most have the lowest base level of cortisol. And so we're mammals, and when we touch each other, our stress levels drop. So when someone's really freaking out, I had a good friend whose wife had cancer, give me a good hug. And then it's like, okay, this feels, and we need that human contact when we're going through hard times and stressful times. So if our kids, and obviously your kids may resist it because there are these balancing prerogatives. When you're an adolescent, you have one prerogative of individuation and separating from parents, but also we can help them, ground them in, a good hug if they're willing to do it, or a pet, having a dog they can pet. And if you can love on your dog, your cat, for, then suddenly that also brings down the level of stress hormone. And then there's a whole thing about stress, and we are learning how to develop skills, cultivate things. So some stress actually is okay. There are some gifts in terms of resilience and so forth. So don't take it all from them, because they're building skills and resources now that'll serve them long after the pandemic. And the ability to self-regulate emotions and feelings, it's still building into their early 20s. But the ability to manage yourself in a hard time will serve them their entire lives. So also one final piece about anxiety, focusing less on external comparisons. That was kind of with the Snap and Instagram. Encourage internal. How am I doing? How was I doing yesterday, the day before, last week, last year? Keeping yourself focused on yourself. So I'm going to stop sharing there. All right. So I think we have a lot of comments in the chat. How are we on time? It is 2:44. All right.
Very good. You gave me a lot of new vocabulary words too, Jed. I love eustress, masturbation, awfulizing. Those are all great words to.
Great. I love, that's Beck, Glenn Beck and Albert. They're the founders of the field, cognitive behavioral. It was all behavioral, it was all Skinner, and then suddenly it shifted in the 60s, and then now it's like, oh, what happens up here actually matters. Mm-hmm. What you tell yourself matters tremendously to how you feel and how you behave. So that your inner dialogue is profound. And so if kids can share with you what are they thinking, and they kind of do a dump of what messages are you telling yourself, and then you can get a sense of what's happening upstairs. Because sometimes you don't know their inner dialogue until you ask them, and that's something I work with kids who take tests. And sometimes they're doing self-sabotage with their inner dialogue, and they're keeping a flat face. You wouldn't know it, but they're freaking out. They're like, oh God, I screwed up. It's all downhill, or it's all going to go down from here. It's like everything's over. It's ruined. I'm not going to get into that college. There are times they go through these scripts, And then part of it is unpacking that and starting to poke holes in that, and in trying to get them to focus on strengths. And other times you overcome other challenges, or it's all about inner resources, having them feel resourced. And sometimes as a therapist, coach, mentor, parent, it's pointing out to them the resources they have. And because sometimes with confirmation bias, you begin to look for your weaknesses and emphasize those and privilege those, and versus you begin to ignore your strengths when you're really in a place of, I feel helpless. And so, learned helplessness. And so it's trying to really draw their attention back to the places where they are efficacious, where they have strengths, and they can use leverage and attend to those more than if they had a setback or a failure, and not really privileging that failure experience. Like, let me see was there any time ever there was a success and a positive outcome? So, all right, there's a lot of comments in the chat. There's also a couple questions in the Q&A.
So let's start with the questions. So Julie had, and we've been chatting back and forth, and there are some questions in the chat. But right now, teens and parents are very anxious about to test or not test. We're all getting questions. Should I drive to another state to take the test? How am I going to be disadvantaged if I don't take it?
Right.
And the virus and college inspection. I mean, they're all inconsistent and they change. Day to day. So what are your suggestions in terms of helping parents and students navigate that?
And I do just see there was one thing from Eugenie. The type of therapy I mentioned was called Hakomi, Hakomi. It's a kind of somatic, body-centered, but it's really awesome. There's some Gestalt in there. I did it for a year and a half, and so Hakomi therapy. Look it up. There are awesome therapists out there. But in terms of this thing,
spell it again. Hoky.
Hakomi. It's a word which means to observe. It's like I think Hakomi, Hakomi. And it's like there's like a stork looking at the pond. It's contemplative. It's slower, and it's also what's happening in your body, and looking for insights to your state of mind from what's happening in your physical body. And that's why, as a therapist, I'm going to be observing. Is there congruence between what you're saying and what your face and body are doing? And if if things are not congruent, and you're saying something, but your foot's tapping, what's your foot doing? And what's it, sometimes your body language of saying, I'm really open to this, and my body's as tight as a fist. It's you're turning on the channel of the body's information, because the body's speaking too, and often louder than actual words. And it's when you're working with a teenager or anyone or a client, it's like looking for the congruence between what they're saying and then the tone and then the physical expression, because the body is also speaking constantly. But in terms of with this question, the way I answered that question, over the summer, we worked with hundreds of kids who tested. We had hundreds of kids taking the June and July ACTs. And by and large, in all their markets, from Texas to Virginia to Carolina to Seattle, their experiences, they felt there was distancing. They were not close to anybody in the time. They were wearing masks. There was hand sanitizer. Our kids felt safe. And so in terms of the level of safety, I think it's actually safer to take a 3-hour test than be going to school over the course of a week. In terms of there's no meal time, there's no time in the halls. It's just that you distance going in, you sit, and then you leave. And so, but everyone has to figure out their level of the risk profile. If I have a very immunocompromised member of the family at home, someone's sick, I have a condition, and then that could obviously change it, because whenever you leave the house, there's going to be some level of risk. The only way you have zero risk is stay at home and get everything delivered to you. But at some point, I went to have my teeth cleaned last week. I put it off for 4 months. Then it's what? I've got to do it. And then my mask is off, my person's working, but I'm okay with that. I'm not going to go to a gym and work out. For me, my level of risk. But everyone has to figure out what's your level of risk tolerance. But I think it's relatively low and there are different kinds of masks, different levels of protection. Like when I go to a place with lots of people, I actually wear this KN95 mask, which is much more protective. It's like the medical grade one. You can get them now in pharmacies and things. And so, but my experience is our kids did okay. None of our students, if they're hundreds, and so in the grand scheme of thing, I think it's a personal decision. But in terms of how much it matters, if your kid is a decent test taker, this could be a meaningful part of their profile this year. And so, about 1 million kids have already taken these tests already. Some kids, like if I've had parents ask me, my kids, there's a fairly weak test taker. Should I take it? I'm like, well, you know what? Because of this test optional explosion, if your kid's going to be in the bottom quartile of testing, they've historically not been great at this piece of it, I wouldn't worry about it. But it's like, do I report my AP scores? Or if they're going to strengthen the application, then I would say go for it. If I think there's a chance that I have the school's range of their middle 50 percentile, my kid on their practice test, they're doing this, like, you know what, that'll put them actually towards that upper part of the range. Then I think in that regard, if I can get a good seat, I would go for it. There is the element of how far must I travel, and it varies dramatically by region. I did this exercise where I was signing into my College Board account, my state account, and in Atlanta, it's easy. I was able to sign up for a test in August, 10 miles from my house for the SAT and for the ACT. If you're in Seattle, there's nothing in August. There's nothing in September. And I'm driving 80 miles at a minimum. So there's certain markets in the Bay Area, very, very tough. In Seattle, very tough. But even like in New York, no, there's nothing for August, September, but October, I can go to Brooklyn. And so so it really depends on where you live. But I think as you go a little further out, there are more options. If you're a junior, if I'm a senior, and this is my shot. If I'm a junior, I'm okay waiting some. But if you're a junior, this is your shot. And I would say sign up for a couple and consider signing up for both the SAT and the ACT. And December is okay. I mean, people are nervous. I know deadlines are coming up for early in, late October, November. But I think this year is going to be a very strange year in admissions. And a lot of people are going to be bumped into the regular pool, in which case your testing from December will count perfectly. If you are deferred early and without testing, and they haven't resourced up their admissions offices, they're going to have this crush of applications for a lot of schools, especially schools that are very selective, who historically the test scores that were issued, people opted out of the pool because their test scores were low, and now it's optional. We're going to see, again, the top schools, the very, very top schools. Mid-level schools, we may see applications decline because some people aren't willing to cross the country and travel. I think they're going to be, most kids are going to be applying to some school relatively closer to their home than they would maybe ordinarily in a non-pandemic year. But I think the various local schools will see a lot more apps coming in. And so having good test scores, again, it's not required, but it's one more piece. Like Cornell was very clear that if you don't have test scores, or it'll change our algorithm. It'll change. We'll have more scrutiny on other things. And so if you have testing, we like testing. But if you don't, there are ways in. And so that's kind of the answer. That it depends on the marketplace you're in and on your expectation based on your practice testing. Because if you're really testing not well for that school, I wouldn't go through the process in this year. I would take advantage of the optional world, and I would say this year, I'm going to skip it, but if I'm a decent test taker, I'm going to find a way to do it to make that a part of my application.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it really is very much regional based, and then it brings up a whole issue of equity and non-equity because some students have access and some don't, and and just balancing all that. And so, a lot of things that you talked about, the things that are very much help students to manage and de-stress is that personal connection, human interaction, and those are the things they can't have right now. So are some of the other things you talked about, will they kind of fill that void, or, can like doing Zoom calls with your friends, or
it's better than
exercise, can they help fill that, since that one thing is not really available right now?
The physical connections we have with our, if I have a pet, love on the pet. If I can go outside and walk in the woods, if I can go and stand and walk in a stream, I was doing that this morning. I was walking in a stream over by Stone Mountain in Atlanta. Things that get yourself back centered. Playing music you like, taking a bath, things that kind of, I was reading a book last night versus just, watching Netflix. So there are things we can do, and I would rather talk to my friends. And part of it's generational. I was born in the 70s, but I still prefer talking to my friends than texting my friends. But there is a different emotional pop that you get when you hear someone's voice than when you just get a text. And some kids are playing games, talking to their friends, but hearing the voices is actually important, and it is more grounding and calming. So you do everything you can. And if people are baking, they're getting back in touch with their senses and their bodies, and that's a good thing. And so any things that are real, even attending a service online, or listening to Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, things that are centering versus things that are anxiety. And there are a million apps, and the Headspace app, and if you want to do some kind of centering, meditation, mindfulness work. But even if you aren't down with that, there are other things that are less digital, more more analog. More analog is better for lower anxiety. That's the idea.
I think that's very interesting that those old-fashioned things are now considered analog. It's like, yeah. That's very fitting. So yeah. Julie says, what about your stress level, knowing you're running a testing business for your own livelihood? And many schools are rethinking testing. Are they going to go away, do you think?
No, I don't think they're going to go away. I think, but we're going to have a crisis in terms of assessment and evaluation. And part of it, we've already seen that grades over the past 20, 30 years, they've been increasing. And the recent study out of California was that grades are less predictive of performance in college than they have been before. There's a lot of kids with A's. And then part of it, you're going to have a real challenge to build a class. And without doing a lottery or some kind of a matching system, like for med school residency programs or a Dutch auction. How do we do it? Testing has always been a pretty important, an important predictor of performance in college, both 1 year, 4 year, and graduation rates, GPA and so without that, then GPA is more important. And part of it, if GPA becomes that much more meaningful, we're going to see even more grade inflation. And that's something we saw like in Georgia the year, after we got in place this Hope Scholarship, it's free tuition or very reduced with over a 3.0 average. Suddenly C's disappeared. And teachers stopped giving C's in the same because we had teachers say, if I give my kid a C, I'm taking money out of their parents' pocket. And then suddenly it's like then all the GPAs began pushing up after this happened. And so if we say testing is now gone, it's all GPA, you rest assured that parents, they're going to focus like hawks on hitting those GPA targets and putting pressure, buying the tutoring, which we do. Part of it, we do academic tutoring. My first client I ever worked with, was an academic kid before testing. So we do this work. And so the portion of our book will shift from assessments to helping kids getting A's in calculus and physics and chemistry, which we already do. And we have amazing tutors, so they pivot pretty easily. And it's kind of just doing a little bit of rebranding, but we already have the workforce in place. But I just don't know, because part of it, like the California research, it's so interesting. It's so political right now. It's so charged. The faculty voted 51-0 to keep testing for 5 years, but the regents, they're not teachers. They aren't working with the kids. They voted to make it optional. To get rid of it. And so there's definitely a disconnect there. There's really a challenge there. Because the research from California was very clear that the tests themselves are actually, very predictive, and they're not redundant with GPA. Like they're helping and identify, kids from diverse backgrounds who would do well at UC. And the biggest impediment at UC was actually the differences in A through G grades for minority applicants and, non-minority. So it's like ultimately, I don't know. I think when the dust all settles, we're going to have more schools test optional, a few schools blind. And optional, I'm fine with optional. Like Bowdoin and Bates, they've been optional for 30, 40 years. And about 8 in 10 kids who get into Bates and Bowdoin, have a test score. Chicago, about 9 in 10 kids, they're optional for several years. It's fine. And there's a lane for kids who have, weaker testing. But the majority of kids who are getting in have good test scores. So I think optional is a world apart from blind, in which case we're putting nothing on these tests. And that, to me, when you go test blind, that's when you open yourself up, especially for schools that are super selective, like, Catholic, whatever, they can go test blind. They're not very selective. Loyola, New Orleans, whatever. Sarah Lawrence tried it. They went back. But blind, it makes it harder because there are a lot of kids. It's one more differentiator. Then one of my friends is talking about how do we create some assessment then? Like we need some way to distinguish applicants who look the same.
Right.
And, testing in every other country, That's in every other industrialized nation. They have a test of some sort. The Gaokao test, the A levels. There's some assessment. And to say we're going to be the only one which has, we're not going to have anything standardized, then you enter the world of incredible subjectivity of grading scales, because grading scales and more affluent schools have more grade inflation, and like you open your door to that, then suddenly all our kids have A's, and it's like, well, that's great. And I like having something which keeps kids honest. I like having an AP exam which says, okay, you have a 94 in your AP chemistry class, you got a 2 on the exam. That tells me something about your 94. That tells me something about your level of mastery. And and so in terms of placement, other things, because I don't always trust grades. Grades often are given to reward effort, and grades are given to reward attitude. Grades aren't always given to reward mastery and criterion reference versus something standardized. And whether it's the AP exam or whether it's we use the PISA or we use any kind of assessment, whatever. Something that is going to be uniform across the country, I think, has value, whether it's the SAT or something else, because there are 30,000 high schools in the U.S. and and the grading cultures vary dramatically across the country, from school to school in the same neighborhood. This school grades easily. This school is very, very tough. But over the past 30 years, we've seen schools across the country getting easier with grading versus the kind of grades in the 50s and 60s where C's were commonplace. Right. And, kids were failed. Now it's like, you don't fail them. You give them, gentlemen's, whatever it is, you pass them on to the next class. And so there are kids with very weak academic skills who never had an F in their life, but they keep being passed forward and they can barely read. At some level, a good friend is a professor at Penn State. He's been there for 15 years. He's like, the quality of kids I'm seeing now, he's lamenting and complaining dramatically. He keeps like, there's a change. And they have good grades. But in terms of the skills they're bringing, he's seeing a sense of there's been some atrophy. And even though their grades aren't showing that. So I don't know. And ultimately, before I got into this industry and after I leave it, I like standardized objective measurement. And I always will. And I'm going to find, whatever test we use, something that is the same. That's me. That's how I think,
Well, we are out of time, but you asked a really good question, so we're going to close with this. She said, what are some good grounding questions to open up a student session to help focus them? What are some good questions that we can use with our students?
Okay, so grounding questions in terms of to help them get centered. Part of it, you're going to open some of the general in terms of how you're feeling. And I would ask a feeling question, not how are you doing, but how are you feeling about all this? I would get a sense of their emotional state. How's it been for you going through this? What's your experience been like? Open questions, and then let them talk, and you can probe and some anxiety, So a little bit of nervousness there, some fear. I hear that, and so you're attending, you're validating, so they can go deeper into it. And I'm going to ask them again. I like a strengths-based focus. What have you been doing to help address that, and how's that working? What have you done in the past? Are there any other domains? I often want to pull from other domains. Like if they're an athlete or they're a performer of some sort and they have some tricks, what have you ever used before? And are you bringing those to bear here now? Is it helping you? And some people, I go for a run in the morning. Some people, I do this. I talk to this friend who's a centering guiding force, or my grandmother or so-and-so. And are you doing those things now? How is that working? What's not helping you now? And sometimes what's contributing to your anxiety? And it may be a person or a friend or so-and-so who's on your ear, who's ratcheting, because often, especially girls, there's a thing of co-rumination. And they're the group mind, and they can make each other nuts, thinking about things. A part of it is the people in your world who are upregulating anxiety and the people who are downregulating your anxiety, and being mindful of the people to whom you expose, like the time you spend with them, and having some control over that. And that this person is making me crazy. And they're calling and texting and this, and I feel worse after I hang up the phone with them or I get their texts. So it's getting them to be more thoughtful, a little more metacognitive about the people, the influences, the inputs in their lives that are helping and hurting. And you could even draw a thing. What's helping your anxiety? What's decreasing it? And then go through from whether food, and again, have them do the inventory. Well, this helps me. Staying up till 3 a.m, playing Fortnite doesn't help me. Or talking to Jennifer helps me. talking to Bill makes me crazy. This, reading this blog makes me nuts, doing this. And so getting a sense of their own world and the inputs in their system, kind of thinking in terms of systems, analyzing their system and saying, how can we help you optimize your current system? And do you feel adequately resourced? How do you feel about, do you feel like you have the resources you need? And so you're getting them, because again, they're entering adulthood soon. And the thing of it, right now they're in your home, and you could help them and guide them and show them. This is kind of, like dialectical behavioral therapy, a little bit of deep, helping them. There's something called distress tolerance, like being able to handle some stress, being able to handle some pain, because there's going to be pain in life beyond the pandemic. There are going to be breakups, and you're going to lose jobs and promotions, and things happen. And it's, what resources are you resourced enough to handle setbacks, and what's your go-to versus I'm going to cut myself to feel the cascade of, the endorphin and things till I feel, versus, or I drink, or I can use other things compulsively, or I shop, or I use sexuality. There are 1,000 ways to handle stress, and adults find a million ways versus this one's really adaptive, this one's really maladaptive. And versus I'm going to eat a bunch of sugar. Like everyone has a way of dealing with pain and stress. And I want to start getting a dialogue going of the things they're going to, how's it working out, short-term and long-term, and the other things. And if you tried this, and can you do more of this? So you're starting to talk about their inventory of their skills and their resources, and then making them aware of which path they're choosing. Because part of it is they have a choice, and not sometimes it feels like a click whir, like an automatic. There's a sense of automatically. I hear bad news, I cut myself. I'm going to go in the bathroom. I'm going to binge eat and throw out. Things. I can't control this. I'm going to control this. Versus that's a very common addictive move. Versus, okay, you feel some stress. Can you sit with it? Can you tolerate some level of distress? And then what will help you get resourced? Let me kind of close my eyes and go for a walk, go for a jog, talk to a friend, getting them ready to be adults. So I think this pandemic is really preparation for the other stressors they're going to inevitably face. Because there are many things, pandemic's going to end, but there are hard times in life.
Yeah, it's still going to go on. Very true. Very true. Jed, if somebody needs to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
Info at Applerouth. Just shoot me a text. And this was fun.
Thank you so much. This is lots of great comments, lots of great, people really were sharing and felt that this was very, very helpful. So, not only for our students, but for ourselves too. So, we're all experiencing all of this together, and to have more understanding of stress and anxiety and fear, what that definition and, understand that is very, very helpful. So, and as I've mentioned, this is recorded, so people will be able to share this with others. So. Thank you, Jed. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. I did notice one of our participants is going to be one of our guest speakers in a couple weeks. I want to do a shout out to Susan DeBar. She's going to be talking about just building your own brand and your authentic self, and, marketing and different things. So be watching for a link for that. And next week, we're going to have Brian Safdari, and he is going to be talking about that mindset, and how a positive mindset, and how to use that in your business as you work with students and families, and to build your, to contribute to the things that you're trying to do. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Jed, very much, and hope everybody has a great weekend, and continue staying safe and strong. And just keep sharing those giggles, Jed. those are just great. Hug people that you can. So I'm very grateful. I get to hug my 3 grandsons every day, and now I can tell them psychologically I need it. So, all right, everybody, thank you very much. Bye-bye.